In astrology, Mercury is commonly labeled as the planet of communication, but this simplification fails to capture the full psychological and symbolic complexity of the Mercury function. Mercury governs far more than just speech or social interaction. It is the principle of cognition itself. It structures how we perceive, process, categorize, translate, and transmit information, both internally and externally. Where the moon governs the continuity of inner feeling and the sun represents the developing identity, Mercury serves as the translator between internal states and external realities. It is the bridge between perception and expression, between sensation and thought, between the private mind and the public world. This script explores Mercury not in terms of sign or placement, but as a universal psychic function, the symbolic architecture of thinking, learning, expressing, and interpreting. It is the cognitive scaffolding that shapes how one makes sense of the world, and, in turn, how one is understood within it. Mercury governs the structure and style of thought. It does not dictate what we believe, a function of values and worldview, but how we arrive at beliefs, what we notice, how we categorize information, and the mental filters we apply to experience. It is the engine of mental activity, classification, pattern recognition, association, abstraction, articulation. Mercury governs not only formal reasoning but also informal cognition, intuition, inference, quick judgments, and even self-talk. From an analytic psychology perspective, Mercury functions like the ego's internal narrator. It organizes the flow of experience into structured mental narratives. Without Mercury, consciousness would be disordered, unable to differentiate between thought and sensation, between memory and imagination. Mercury is not content, it is structure. It determines how content is acquired, sequenced, and communicated. At its core, Mercury governs symbolic thinking, the uniquely human capacity to use language, signs, and representations to stand in for real things. This function enables language acquisition and usage, concept formation, metaphor and analogy, the translation of feeling into form. Mercury is the mediator between the symbolic and the real. It allows us to represent internal experience externally, through speech, writing, gesture, image, or code. It is the organ of abstraction, enabling us to manipulate concepts that are not present, tangible, or even real. In this way, Mercury also governs meaning-making. It is how we name what we feel, how we give shape to the chaotic stream of consciousness, and how we create shared frameworks of understanding. Mercury governs not only thought but perception, the intake and processing of sensory information. This includes auditory and visual processing, attention and focus, pattern recognition, the filtering of signal from noise. Perception is not passive. It is always selective. Mercury defines what we notice, what we ignore, and how we frame incoming data. It constructs mental models of the world, maps, not territories, that guide thought and action. This perceptual function is often shaped by early developmental and cultural factors, but astrologically, Mercury describes the default style of perception. Whether one sees in wholes or parts, in metaphor or detail, in abstraction or immediacy. How we see is inseparable from how we think. Mercury is the symbolic eye of the mind. Language is Mercury's most explicit domain. Mercury governs both the internal language of thought and the external language of communication. This includes vocabulary and syntax, verbal fluency or inhibition, writing and reading, humor, irony, storytelling. But language is more than words. It is a symbolic medium through which thought is organized and shared. Mercury reflects how one navigates this medium, how easily thoughts become words, how accurately feelings are named, and how clearly internal ideas are made external. A well-integrated Mercury suggests coherence between inner thought and outer speech. A conflicted Mercury might speak volumes while saying nothing, or feel intensely while remaining silent. Mercury is the function that bridges the invisible world of thought with the shared world of speech. Astrologically, Mercury describes one's preferred style of thinking. This is not a measure of intelligence, but of cognitive orientation. Some of the qualities governed by Mercury include analytical versus synthetic reasoning, concrete versus abstract thought, sequential versus associative logic, linear versus holistic processing. These differences influence not only how people solve problems, but how they ask questions, how they explain things, and how they learn. A structured Mercury may favor outlines, definitions, and logical progressions. An intuitive Mercury may prefer metaphor, spontaneity, and nonlinear synthesis. Neither is superior. Both reflect valid cognitive architectures. Understanding Mercury is essential for understanding how one processes complexity, and what kind of intellectual terrain feels natural or difficult. Learning is a fundamentally Mercurial process. It involves the reception, integration, and retrieval of information. Mercury governs both how one learns and what kinds of environments facilitate learning. This includes preferred learning methods, visual, verbal, kinesthetic, curiosity and information-seeking behavior, retention and synthesis, mental agility and cognitive flexibility. Mercury also governs the limits of learning, where confusion, overwhelm, or rigidity may arise. A strained Mercury might struggle to translate experience into coherent knowledge or get trapped in mental loops. Learning is not only intellectual, it is emotional and existential. Mercury enables one to reframe experience as insight, to articulate questions, and to connect new information to existing knowledge structures. It is through Mercury that knowledge becomes wisdom, or remains disjointed data. Mercury governs the entire communicative process, not just what is said, but how it is said, when it is said, and whether it is understood. Key Mercurial domains include tone and cadence, choice of words and register, timing and rhythm, listening and comprehension. Mercury also governs the meta-level of communication, the ability to explain, to clarify, to paraphrase, to infer. A strong Mercury may show up as rhetorical skill, teaching ability, or verbal dexterity. A challenged Mercury may create gaps between intention and expression, leading to misunderstanding or misrepresentation. Mercury does not promise emotional resonance. That is another domain. Its role is technical and structural, ensuring the form of communication is coherent, appropriate, and intelligible. Mythologically, Mercury, Hermes, is a dual figure, both divine messenger and trickster, boundary crosser and guide. Psychologically, this duality persists. Mercury governs both clarity and ambiguity, both sense-making and disorientation. This includes irony, sarcasm and humor, deception and concealment, wordplay and ambiguity, multivocality, speaking with multiple meanings. Mercury is not always linear or literal. It thrives on multiplicity, paradox, and inversion. This is why Mercury is often prominent in writers, poets, comedians, and philosophers, those who bend language to new uses. The dual nature of Mercury also governs ambivalence. It is the mind that can hold two contradictory ideas without needing resolution. This can be liberating or maddening, depending on the context. Mercury is the symbolic trickster, not to deceive maliciously, but to disrupt rigidity and introduce cognitive flexibility. Among the traditional planets, Mercury is the most neutral. It is neither inherently benefic nor malefic, neither emotional nor rational. It simply adapts. Mercury's neutrality is its strength. It can move between systems, translate across boundaries, and mediate opposing forces. It allows one to inhabit different perspectives, to suspend judgment, and to navigate complexity without collapse. This neutrality also makes Mercury essential in conflict resolution, diplomacy, and critical thinking. It enables one to ask rather than assert, to explore rather than conclude. A developed Mercury does not seek to dominate discourse but to facilitate it, to serve as a conduit, not a weapon. One of Mercury's highest expressions is intellectual integrity, the commitment to coherence, honesty, and clarity in thought and speech. This includes saying what one means, thinking clearly and critically, admitting ignorance or error, seeking understanding, not just agreement. In a time of information overload and rhetorical manipulation, Mercury's ethical dimension becomes crucial. The capacity to think independently, evaluate arguments, and remain intellectually curious is a form of psychic hygiene. A distorted Mercury may seek to impress, manipulate, or obscure. A refined Mercury serves truth, not in an abstract moral sense, but in the pursuit of clarity and understanding. Internally, Mercury governs self-talk, the ongoing dialogue we conduct with ourselves throughout the day. This includes mental narration of events, internalized language of parents or culture, interpretations of self and world, scripts for action and justification. Self-talk shapes emotional regulation, behavior, and self-concept. A harsh or chaotic Mercury may create internal conflict, rumination, or distortion. A clear, compassionate Mercury facilitates inner coherence and cognitive resilience. By examining Mercury's patterns, we can access the tone of the inner voice and begin to reframe how we speak to ourselves. Like all planetary functions, Mercury evolves over time. Its developmental arc moves from reactive cognition to reflective thought. This means from imitation to originality, from absorption to analysis, from scattered input to synthesized understanding. The mature Mercury is discerning, articulate, and open-minded. It knows how to filter information, when to speak, and when to listen. It is precise but not rigid, curious but not gullible. Developing Mercury involves refining one's capacity for thought, dialogue, and perspective-taking. It is the lifelong task of becoming intellectually awake and linguistically responsible. Mercury is not a minor function. It is the nervous system of the psyche, the network through which sensation becomes thought, thought becomes language, and language becomes relationship. It governs how we learn, how we explain, how we ask, and how we listen. It shapes the very process by which the self becomes intelligible to itself and to others. In modern life, Mercury is under constant strain. We are inundated with language, overwhelmed with data, and seduced by performance over understanding. In this context, reclaiming Mercury means reclaiming the discipline of thinking clearly, expressing truthfully, and listening generously. To work with Mercury is not to become more clever, it is to become more conscious of the medium through which all thinking and speaking takes place. And in doing so, we begin to rehumanize the mind. Mercury's function is not to impress, but to connect, not just with others, but with the deeper currents of meaning that language, at its best, can reveal.